The Groom Who Left. A second chance forged in silence. Give us a like now and subscribe so you don't miss the checkmate. What happens when the man who left you at the altar returns 5 years later, only to find a daughter who looks exactly like him? This is the story of Audrey Wells, the abandoned bride, and Dominic Vance, the successful mogul who learned the true cost of ambition. Their journey is one of betrayal, single motherhood, and the painstaking, quiet work of earning a second chance. The walk away. The garden was in full bloom, bathed in warm sunlight, and bordered by white roses, lanterns, and guests dressed in soft pastel shades. Audrey Wells stood at the altar, her hands tightly gripping her bouquet, trying to calm the trembling that ran through her body. It wasn't nerves of doubt. She loved Dominic Bennett more than she had ever loved anyone. It was the overwhelming reality of being on the verge of the life they had dreamed of together, a life she had imagined for so long that it felt almost surreal that it was finally there. The whispers of anticipation around her faded into a blur as she focused on the path ahead, waiting for him to appear. But the minutes passed, and Dominic did not arrive. At first, she thought perhaps something, traffic, a call, a last-minute emergency, had delayed him. But when her maid of honor leaned in and whispered something that made her stomach churn, Audrey knew something was terribly wrong. Dominic wasn't just late. He wasn't coming. The words didn't register at first. Her brain refused to process them, as if her heart had blocked the message to protect her. But then came the ripple through the guests, the confused glances, the murmurs, the awkward silence, and, finally, the confirmation from someone close to Dominic's inner circle. He had left with Serena Hale, his ex-girlfriend, and they had been seen driving away minutes before the ceremony. Audrey didn't cry. Not yet. She remained motionless for a long time, as if she were frozen by the blow that had just shattered everything around her. Guests began to move, some already leaving, others offering strained words of comfort. Her mother tried to speak to her, but Audrey pulled away from everyone, turned around, and walked down the aisle alone. No one stopped her. She didn't want to be touched, pitied, or questioned. She walked out of the venue garden and directly into a car that drove her far away from the spectacle. Inside, she was falling apart. Her heart cracked in slow, painful waves. She kept seeing his face, the way he used to look at her when he promised her forever, when he kissed her forehead and told her nothing would come between them. She had believed him so much that she hadn't told him she was pregnant. Not because she was hiding it, but because she wanted that moment to be perfect, intimate, something they would celebrate together in the quiet after the wedding. But now that moment was gone, replaced by humiliation, betrayal, and a void so sharp it made her physically ill. Alone in the small apartment they had chosen together, but never moved into, Audrey stared at the photo of the ultrasound tucked inside her planner. It was still very early, only a few weeks. She hadn't told anyone yet, but now everything was different. The future she had planned was gone, and she would have to start over. Pregnant, alone, and heartbroken. The realization came slowly, but it hit her with brutal clarity. Dominic had chosen someone else, not just over a relationship, but over the family they had unknowingly already started. Audrey sat there until the sun set. The weight of the day hung over her like a blanket she couldn't shrug off. She knew she couldn't stay. Not in this city, not in this life that had betrayed her. So that night, while the media speculated, and her name trended in gossip articles for being the jilted bride, Audrey packed a small bag, gathered the little money she had, and silently disappeared. No explanation, no revenge, no contact, just silence. Because sometimes the only way to heal is to vanish from the place where you were broken and start anew in a place where no one knows your name. The quiet coast. Audrey didn't look back as the train left the city. Her reflection flickered in the window alongside the blur of passing trees and buildings. Her face was pale and drawn, but resolute. She had chosen a small coastal town, far from the noise, far from the tabloids, and far from the life that had crumbled in a single afternoon. It was a town where no one would recognize her as the runaway bride, where they wouldn't pity her or whisper about her. It wasn't glamorous or full of opportunities, but it was quiet, and that was all she needed. She arrived with only 2 suitcases and a single goal: survive for herself and for the life quietly growing inside her. The first few weeks were brutal. She stayed in a rundown motel until she could find a studio apartment that didn't ask too many questions. Her savings, once carefully planned with Dominic's encouragement, had been locked in joint accounts she no longer had access to. She took sporadic jobs, helping at a florist shop, cleaning vacation rentals, folding clothes at a small laundromat. No one knew she had once dined in penthouses or worn custom-made dresses. No one knew she cried herself to sleep every night, clutching her stomach and whispering promises to the baby she hadn't met yet. Eventually, she landed a part-time job at the town's only bookstore, a small, cozy spot owned by an elderly woman named Margaret, who had no interest in who Audrey used to be. Margaret offered her the kind of acceptance she needed: quiet, kind, and non-judgmental. For the first time in weeks, Audrey began to breathe again. The smell of old books, the hum of quiet music, the soft chatter of regulars, it all helped stitch the pieces of herself back together. As the months passed, her belly grew, and so did her determination. She began preparing for motherhood with the same quiet resolve she once put into wedding plans. She read every parenting book she could find, attended free clinics, and took long walks by the shore when the nausea or loneliness grew too great. The baby kicked for the first time in the middle of a thunderstorm. Audrey was sitting on the windowsill, listening to the rain and silently crying, when she felt the faintest flutter beneath her skin. It felt like a message. You're not alone. We're in this together. When Chloe was born on a quiet spring morning, Audrey held her and cried harder than she ever had in her life. The girl had soft, fine blonde hair and striking blue eyes that looked up at her with innocent wonder. There was no denying the resemblance. She looked exactly like her father. But Audrey didn't allow bitterness into the room. Not that day. That day was sacred. She named her Chloe because it meant wisdom. And in that fragile moment, nothing felt truer. Motherhood was nothing like she expected. It was harder, messier, and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. She had no family to lean on, no friends from her old life who even knew where she was. But the town slowly began to embrace her. Margaret became a quiet grandmother figure, offering free books and extra tea bags. The woman who ran the daycare helped watch Chloe when Audrey had long shifts, and the barista at the cafe next door always made her coffee just right, without asking how she was. 3 years passed like a slow tide. Audrey still thought about Dominic sometimes, especially on hard days, or when Chloe asked why she didn't have a daddy. But she never spoke his name. She had built a world that didn't include him, one made of bedtime stories, beach picnics, and soft lullabies. Chloe grew into a bright, curious girl, with her mother's quiet resilience and her father's bold eyes. She didn't know their story, only that her mother loved her more than anything in the world. Audrey had sworn to herself that she would never let him back in, no matter what. He had made his choice, and she had survived without him. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that fate had already begun to move in the background, charting a course that would cause their worlds to collide again in a way she never expected. 5 years and a collision. Dominic Bennett stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass wall in his penthouse, overlooking the city he had once ruled with confident ease, now observing it as if through a barrier he no longer understood. 5 years had passed since the wedding day that never was. 5 years since he had walked away from the only woman who had truly known him. The regret was not sudden. It had accumulated slowly over time, layer by layer, as his once carefully structured world began to unravel from the inside out. The marriage to Serena had lasted less than 2 years, and every day of it had been a quiet war. She was shrewd, beautiful, and destructive in ways he hadn't seen until it was too late. Their relationship, born of vanity and pressure, had collapsed into bitterness and betrayal. When the divorce papers were signed, there wasn't even a fight, just silence, as if neither of them had anything left worth saying. But even after she left, Dominic didn't find peace. The penthouse remained cold no matter how high the heat was turned. The parties felt empty, and the success that once made him feel invincible now felt like an anchor around his neck. His father, who had once insisted on the marriage to Serena to secure alliances and expand his company's influence, now barely spoke to him, except in board meetings. And as the business grew, Dominic began to shrink inside, his identity dissolving into the hallways of corporate obligation. He tried distraction. He traveled, bought properties, even dated again. But none of the relationships lasted more than a few weeks. There was always a missing piece, a quiet voice reminding him of what he had left behind. Not just the woman, but the chance to build something real, something lasting. He had replayed that day in his mind so many times. Her face at the altar, the confusion, the pain, how she hadn't screamed or run after him, how she had simply vanished. He had told himself she was better off, that they weren't meant to be. But with every passing year, that lie became harder to hold. One night, alone in his office, Dominic found himself searching for her name. There were no pictures, no recent updates, no social media, nothing. It was as if she had completely disappeared. He even hired a private investigator once, but canceled the contract halfway through, feeling it would be a betrayal of her silence. He told himself that if she wanted to be found, she would have left a trail. But still, her absence gnawed at him. It wasn't just guilt. It was the feeling that he had walked away from the only chance he had had to be truly happy. And the worst part, he didn't know what he had destroyed. He thought about how she had looked at him in the final weeks before the wedding. There had been something in her eyes, something she hadn't said aloud. He had been too consumed by corporate politics and family pressure to notice it then, but now it tormented him. What had he missed? Dominic began to pull back from the spotlight, cutting his hours, declining major appearances, refusing interviews and public engagements. He spent more time reading, walking the quieter parts of the city, and sitting alone in coffee shops, watching strangers with their families. He had everything he once thought mattered: wealth, status, power, yet he had never felt more empty. On the 5th anniversary of what should have been their wedding day, he booked a flight with no destination in mind, just the need to move, to escape the airlessness of his life. At the airport, dressed casually in jeans and a dark sweater, with no assistants, no press, no entourage, he felt more like himself than he had in years. He stopped at a coffee kiosk near his boarding gate. As he waited for his drink, something caught his eye. A flash of movement, a familiar curve of a face in the crowd. He turned almost by instinct and saw her. Audrey hadn't changed much, though her features were more defined, her hair longer, her posture stronger. She was holding the hand of a small girl, no older than 5, with soft blonde curls and striking blue eyes that hit Dominic like a bolt of lightning. He couldn't breathe. The world didn't spin or slow down. It simply froze. That face, those eyes, that child, his daughter. He knew it without a doubt. And in that moment, every missed call, every regret, every dream he had tried to bury, came rushing back. The truth in her eyes, before he could decide what to do, Audrey looked up and saw him. Audrey's heart stopped the moment her eyes met his. The time that had stretched and healed and reshaped her life over the past 5 years suddenly collapsed into that single second of recognition. Dominic was only a few feet away, frozen mid-step, holding a coffee cup he didn't seem to realize was tilting slightly in his hand. His gaze wasn't on her. It was on Chloe. Audrey instinctively leaned down, gently guiding her daughter closer, as if to shield her from a memory that had just come to life. Chloe, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air, tugged at Audrey's hand and pointed to a display of stuffed animals, asking quietly if they could go look. Audrey nodded, her voice caught in her throat, and they turned away, as if walking away could undo the collision of 2 worlds that should never have met again. But Dominic didn't move, and Audrey knew he had seen too much. She didn't rush. She didn't run. Instead, she found a quiet bench near a quieter gate and sat down with Chloe, her hands shaking slightly as she helped the child open her snack. Her mind raced. What had just happened? Would he follow? She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the silence of her own imagination. What she would say if they ever crossed paths again. What he would say. How she would remain poised and unmoved. But none of those imagined scenarios prepared her for the way his face looked when he finally approached. Stunned, hesitant, but devoid of the cold arrogance she remembered. He didn't speak immediately. He stood only a few feet away. His voice cracked when he finally found the courage to say her name. "Audrey," he whispered, as if the word itself were fragile. She looked at him with cautious eyes and a stiff nod, but she didn't stand up. She didn't want to make a scene. Not in front of Chloe. Not here. He looked at the child beside her, and it was painfully clear that he already knew the truth. Chloe looked so much like him it hurt to deny it. "Is she?" he began to ask, but his voice broke. Audrey cut him off with a steady gaze. "Yes," she said quietly. "She's yours." The words lay heavy between them. Chloe looked up at the stranger and blinked with curiosity. "Hello," she said simply, her voice bright and undisturbed by the tension her mother couldn't hide. Dominic slowly crouched down, maintaining his distance, unsure if he was allowed to respond. "Hello," he replied softly, and Audrey noticed how carefully he chose his posture, his tone, like a man approaching something sacred, unbreakable. Audrey waited. She didn't explain. She didn't apologize. She didn't owe him that. "I didn't know," he said, still kneeling. "I didn't know, Audrey. I swear." "If you had known," she said in a low voice. "You made your choice. You walked away. You married someone else. I didn't owe you anything after that." Dominic lowered his head for a moment, taking it all in. The gravity of what he had lost. What he had destroyed. "You're right," he said finally. "I have no excuse. I never stopped thinking about you. I thought I could move on, and I didn't even try hard enough to find you. That's my fault." Audrey felt the walls around her soften only slightly. Not because of his words, but because of the honesty in them. He looked older, not in the lines on his face, but in his bearing. His humility. The man in front of her was not the man who had walked out of her life years ago in pursuit of ambition and image. Chloe, bored with the adult conversation, leaned into Audrey and whispered something about wanting juice. Audrey searched her bag and handed her a box. Then she looked at Dominic. "We fly home tonight. She has school Monday." "Where is home?" he asked carefully. She hesitated. "A small town. You wouldn't know it." He nodded, understanding she wasn't ready to give him more than that. Can I see you again?" he asked. And his voice was so low she almost missed it. Audrey stared at him for a long moment. She wasn't ready. She didn't trust him. But Chloe had smiled at him, and something in her chest ached at the thought of denying her daughter the truth she had kept buried. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "This wasn't supposed to happen." "I know," he said, rising slowly, "but I'm glad it did." He didn't ask for contact information. He didn't press. He simply looked at Chloe one last time and whispered, "You are beautiful," before walking away. Audrey sat in silence after he left, her heart pounding, not out of fear, but from the unmistakable feeling that the past had just knocked on the future's door, and this time, it wouldn't go away quietly. The penance of presence, the days following their unexpected airport encounter, unfolded with a strange stillness that Audrey couldn't shake. Her mind kept reliving the moment she saw Dominic there, the stunned look in his eyes, the tremor in his voice, the way he had knelt in front of Chloe, like a man confronting a truth he never imagined. She had returned home, hoping to push him away, to fold him into memory, and move on as she always had. But something had changed. Her world had been so carefully constructed, brick by brick, guarded by routine, and now it pulsed with uncertainty. Chloe, on the other hand, seemed unaffected. She had spoken briefly about the nice man at the airport, asking if they would see him again. Audrey had said she didn't know. It wasn't a lie. She truly didn't. A week passed, then another. And just when Audrey had begun to convince herself that Dominic would disappear once more, a letter arrived, not in the mailbox, but by courier. It was handwritten on heavy stationery, her name spelled out in elegant, unmistakable script. She hesitated before opening it, her fingers tight with misgiving. Inside was no demand or apology, but a plea. Dominic had found the name of her bookstore through quiet, respectful channels. Margaret, the owner, had apparently received a generous, anonymous donation for children's books that same week, and he was asking for a single meeting. Not for drama, not for confrontation, just a conversation. Audrey took 3 days to decide. When she finally agreed, they met at a small, neutral coffee shop halfway between her town and the city. She arrived early, choosing a corner seat with her arms crossed, her jaw tight. She expected him to be late, or to arrive polished and smug as before. Instead, he arrived quietly, in a simple sweater and jeans, no briefcase, no agenda, just the same exhausted expression she remembered from the airport. There was an awkward pause as they sat opposite each other. The clinking of cups, the soft murmur of nearby conversations, the low hum of music filled the space between them. Dominic was the first to speak. He didn't launch into speeches. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He began with one sentence. "She looks exactly like my sister when we were little." Audrey didn't respond, but she didn't leave either. He seemed to take that as a small mercy. He told her about the years he had missed, the unraveling of his marriage to Serena, the way his father's approval had turned to silence, how his business victories had become hollow. He admitted he had thought of Audrey often, not just with regret, but with pain. Pain for the life they could have had, for the daughter he hadn't known he fathered, for the love he had believed he didn't deserve. Audrey listened, unsure if she believed every word, but unable to deny how different he seemed. He didn't ask her anything, only about Chloe, her favorite color, what made her laugh, if she liked animals or had any fears. Audrey was struck by how gently he handled every detail, as if they were delicate crystals he had once shattered and dared not drop again. For the first time in years, she found herself talking freely, recounting stories of her daughter's quirks and talents, her stubbornness, her joy. And when she looked up, she saw tears in Dominic's eyes. Not for show, not manipulation, but something deep and raw that even he hadn't expected. At the end of the meeting, Dominic stood to leave. He didn't ask to see Chloe. He didn't pressure her for more. He simply thanked Audrey for her time. He said he was proud of her and promised that whether she saw him again or not, he would be better because of that day. That night, Audrey couldn't sleep. His words ran through her mind again and again, not because they were perfect, but because they were quiet and honest and utterly devoid of expectation. She had spent years building walls around Chloe and herself, walls that had kept them safe, but also alone. And now, for the first time in a long time, Audrey felt the slightest breeze coming through a crack in those walls. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something she thought she would never feel again. Possibility. A new foundation. In the weeks following their coffee shop meeting, Audrey found herself caught in a silent conflict between instinct and memory. She had built a life based on resilience and control, where every decision revolved around Chloe's stability and her own independence. Letting Dominic back in, even at a distance, threatened that balance. And yet, she couldn't ignore how something inside her had shifted. She found herself thinking about that meeting more than she cared to admit. The way he had asked about Chloe without expectations, the way he hadn't defended his past, the way he had simply listened. He had given her no pressure and no guilt, only a possibility she never thought she would consider again. Audrey decided to take a step, not a leap, but something small. She sent a message to Dominic via the same messenger service that had delivered his letter, asking if he would like to meet Chloe at a public park the following weekend. There were conditions: no gifts, no sudden emotional confessions, and no talking to Chloe about the past. Just presence, just the opportunity to let her daughter decide for herself if she felt safe around him. He replied with a simple, "Thank you, I will be there." And Audrey tried not to let her anxiety show as the day approached. When Saturday mornings arrived, the park was quiet, bathed in the soft gold of early autumn. Audrey dressed Chloe in her favorite polka dot jacket and tied her blonde hair into messy pigtails. She didn't tell her exactly who they were meeting, only that it was a new friend Mommy had met a long time ago. Chloe, always curious, asked a dozen questions on the way, most of which Audrey answered with vague smiles and nervous glances at her watch. Dominic was already there when they arrived, sitting on a bench near the playground, with 2 coffees in hand and a paper bag of muffins beside him. He stood up the moment he saw them, but he didn't rush. Instead, he waited for Audrey to approach. His eyes never left Chloe's face. Audrey gave him a brief nod, gesturing toward the swings, and said, "She likes to start there." What followed was not dramatic or tearful. It was simple, awkward, and strangely peaceful. Dominic stood nearby while Chloe climbed onto the swing, offering to push her gently. At first, she looked to Audrey for reassurance, and when Audrey nodded, Chloe allowed it. Moments passed, and then came the laughter. Small, sweet, spontaneous giggles as the swing went higher and higher. Dominic didn't talk much, but he smiled in a way Audrey hadn't seen since long before their wedding fell apart. It was genuine and quiet, filled with something akin to awe. They spent over an hour together. Dominic helped Chloe feed the ducks. He held her jacket while she ran across the lawn, and even let her place a sticker from a pack she'd brought with her onto his shirt. Audrey watched closely, every instinct on high alert, but found no reason to pull away. He wasn't trying to impress. He wasn't trying to force a connection. He was simply present, and that meant more than any apology. As they prepared to leave, Chloe tugged on Audrey's sleeve and asked if they could go back to the park with Mr. Nick again. Audrey paused, looked at Dominic, and said, "Maybe." Chloe grinned and ran ahead, and for a moment Audrey and Dominic were left in silence. Then she said, "That was better than I expected." Dominic looked at her, hopeful but cautious, and replied, "Thank you for trusting her to me, even for a short time." Audrey didn't respond immediately. She was still processing the ease with which her daughter had accepted him, the comfort in her eyes, the way she had looked at him, not as a stranger, but as someone familiar, as if a part of her had recognized what Audrey had spent years hiding. The wall she had spent so long maintaining was no longer a fortress. It was a gate, and for the first time it was open just a crack. They parted with no promises, but with something else: understanding. And as Audrey walked home hand in hand with Chloe, she realized that this chapter of their lives was not something she had planned, but that didn't mean it couldn't be a good thing, the smallest gesture. The following months unfolded like an unfamiliar melody, quiet at first, cautious in rhythm, but steadily growing more harmonious with each passing week. Dominic became a gentle presence in Chloe's life, not as a sudden, overwhelming force, but as a slow-moving tide that reshaped the coastline without washing it away. He visited on weekends, often bringing simple books or toys he thought she would like, but always following Audrey's rules: no spoiling, no overpromising, no intruding. He understood that his presence in their lives was not a given. He had to earn it, and he didn't try to rush the process. He showed up consistently, and to Audrey's wary surprise, that began to matter. Chloe grew increasingly comfortable around him. She started asking when Daddy Nick was coming back, and one day casually asked Audrey why he didn't live with them. The question took Audrey off guard. She hadn't yet figured out how to explain the complicated history without turning it into a wound. She answered simply by saying that sometimes adults take time to figure out the right way to be a family. Chloe seemed satisfied with that, but Audrey knew the questions would return, and when they did, she promised herself she would be ready with honesty and without bitterness. One chilly late November afternoon, Dominic invited Audrey and Chloe to a children's play in the city. Audrey agreed, though her stomach churned with uncertainty. It would be the first time they appeared in public together, not just as two people who shared a daughter, but as something more complex, more vulnerable. Dominic booked a private box to avoid unwanted attention, a gesture Audrey quietly appreciated. Throughout the performance, Chloe sat between them, giggling, reaching for both of their hands. Audrey watched her daughter's joy and realized that the perfect family she had once dreamed of didn't have to look like the ones in magazines. It could look like this: fractured, repairing, real. Afterward, they went to a quiet coffee shop, the kind with warm lights and worn booths that softened even the hardest conversations. Chloe fell asleep in the booth next to Audrey, her head in her mother's lap, clutching a paper crown from the theater. Dominic sat opposite them. His coffee went cold. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, in a low, unsure voice, he said, "I've been thinking about her future, about yours, about how to be more than just a visitor." Audrey tensed. She knew this moment would come. "Are you asking to move here?" she asked softly, her fingers gently stroking a lock of hair from Chloe's face. "Not yet," Dominic replied, "but I've started looking at properties nearby, offices too. I want to make the right decision, but I also want you to know I'm serious. I'm not leaving this time." Audrey looked at him. His face was not pleading. It was open. He wasn't offering a perfect solution. He was simply offering presence. She thought of the version of him from 5 years ago, polished, proud, calculating. This man was different, softer around the edges, no longer concerned with being untouchable. He had lost things, learned things, and somehow become someone who could sit across from her and talk like this, without guilt or pressure. Still, a part of her held back. She told him honestly, "I don't know if I can forgive everything, Dominic. You hurt me in a way I never thought I would recover from." He nodded slowly, taking in the weight of her words without flinching. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight, or ever. But I hope you'll allow me to show you what should have been from the start, for you and for her." Outside, snow had begun to fall in soft flakes, brushing the windows in a quiet hush. Audrey looked at Chloe. Still asleep, her small chest rising and falling to the rhythm of dreams Audrey couldn't enter. She looked at Dominic and saw a future she hadn't dared to imagine in years. Not perfect, not easy, but maybe, just maybe, worth trying for. So she didn't say anything. She just nodded once, a small gesture that spoke louder than any speech. And that night, as they carried their daughter together through the snow and into the car, something inside Audrey shifted. Not all forgiveness comes in words. Sometimes it begins in the simple act of letting someone stay. Spring. The choice of forever. Spring arrived like a long-held breath, finally released. The town, once shrouded in winter gray, burst into color, and with it came a new sense of rhythm in Audrey's life, one that now included Dominic. It hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't come without its challenges. There were awkward moments and silent missteps, like when he brought Chloe a gift that was too expensive, or when he tried to talk about old times. And Audrey had to remind him that nostalgia wasn't healing, but he listened. He adjusted. Slowly, his presence shifted from guest to familiar. He rented a small house on the outskirts of town, not too close to feel invasive, but close enough to be part of their days. He didn't crash into their world. He waited at the edges, learning to fit into the life Audrey had built. Chloe thrived. Her world expanded with Dominic in it. They shared the same curious eyes and the same stubborn chin. And it grew more obvious with every passing week that she saw in him something Audrey had tried to suppress for years. A sense of belonging. Audrey had fiercely protected her daughter. But watching them together, building birdhouses in the backyard, reading bedtime stories, laughing at the same corny jokes, softened her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was no longer just about forgiving the past. It was about acknowledging the future unfolding before her and realizing she didn't have to face it alone. Audrey was cautious with her own heart. It had been carefully rebuilt brick by brick, and she wasn't willing to risk it lightly. Dominic never pressured her. Instead, he let his actions speak, picking up Chloe from school when she had to work late, making soup when she was sick, helping her mother, who had recently re-entered her life, with doctor visits and shopping. He didn't try to buy her love or demand it. He simply stayed. And that, more than any grand gesture, began to transform her fear into trust. One early May afternoon, they set up a small picnic in the park where they had first reunited. It was nothing elaborate, just sandwiches, lemonade, and a few blankets beneath a blossoming tree. Chloe ran off chasing bubbles while Audrey and Dominic sat side by side, not touching, but close. They talked about everything and nothing: books, childhood, the weather, the strange comfort of quiet routines. Then, as the sun began to set, painting the sky gold, Dominic pulled something from his coat pocket. It wasn't a ring. It was a small, handmade wooden box, the kind that opened with a gentle click. Inside was a pendant, a simple silver heart carved with 3 stars, one for Audrey, one for Chloe, one for the life they were building. He didn't ask her to marry him. He didn't offer a proposal or a promise. Instead, he said, "You don't have to give me an answer. I just want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. Whether we end up together or not, I will always be here for her, and for you, if you'll allow me." Audrey stared at the pendant, her throat tight with an emotion she hadn't expected. It wasn't grandiose, it wasn't public, but it was heartfelt in a way nothing else had ever been. She closed the box slowly and whispered, "You're already here." Then she reached out for the first time in years and took his hand. It was the start of something new. Not a reboot of the past, but the foundation of something they never gave themselves a chance to build before. Not built on illusions or fantasies, but on survival, effort, love, and forgiveness. Months later, Chloe would proudly show her friends the silver pendant around her mother's neck. She would tell them, not understanding the full weight of her words, that it meant her family had found its way back. And for Audrey, it was enough. The story didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be theirs. Final question for the audience. Which was the most meaningful step in Dominic's redemption? The honest tears at the coffee shop, the consistent presence in the small town, the 3-star pendant, commitment without pressure. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Chapter 12. The unveiling of the past. The subtle acceptance of Dominic's presence, marked by the simple act of holding hands, and the 3-star pendant, ushered in a new phase for Audrey and Chloe. The tentative visits evolved into comfortable routines. Dominic sold his large penthouse in the city and moved into the small rental house permanently. It was a symbolic rejection of his old life and a quiet acceptance of the new one. Dominic's work, once a ruthless master, became a flexible tool. He delegated heavily and established a strong remote work structure, focusing his energy on smaller, community-focused investments, a genuine alignment with his newfound values. The ghosts of the city, however, the silence they had built around their lives was about to be broken by the ghosts of the past. Dominic's old life, the world of Bennett and Associates, still revolved around him. One evening, while Audrey and Dominic were out for a quiet dinner, their first alone time in months, a notification flashed on Dominic's phone. It was a forwarded news link from his former lawyer, Charles. The headline was jarring. Serena Hale and Bennett clan heir announce engagement. Merger of power. Audrey saw the headline over his shoulder. The mention of Serena Hale, the woman Dominic had left her for at the altar, jolted her. But the real shock was the Bennett clan heir, Dominic's younger brother, Trevor. The announcement was framed as a strategic alliance aimed at acquiring Dominic's remaining company shares. It was a power play orchestrated by his father, meant to publicly finalize Dominic's irrelevance. Audrey looked up, her expression calm. "They are trying to push you out completely, aren't they?" Dominic's jaw tightened. "They see my retreat as weakness. They think I'm distracted by domesticity. This isn't just business, it's my father's way of publicly erasing me." The old, familiar tension resurfaced, but this time, it was a shared problem. Audrey didn't recoil or accuse. Instead, she asked, "What does Dominic want to do about it? Not the CEO, but the father who just wants to build a birdhouse with his daughter." The defense of a new life. Dominic realized his new life required a new kind of defense. He wasn't fighting for money. He was fighting for time and peace. "I don't want to fight them, Audrey," he confessed, "but I won't let them threaten the stability we've built for Chloe. If I sell my shares now, they will use that capital to expand aggressively, demanding the very travel and schedule I rejected. Then we make a statement," Audrey said, her resilience showing. "Not with a lawsuit, but with a public choice. We show them what your real priority is." They decided to announce their engagement, a quiet, powerful declaration of where Dominic's loyalty now lay. He proposed to her not with a diamond, but with a small silver band carved with 3 stars, mirroring the pendant. "I won't promise you a perfect future, Audrey," he said, holding her hands on the beach where they often walked. "But I promise you a present that is real, honest, and shared." She accepted. A wedding for the present. Their wedding was everything the first one wasn't. Small, simple, and held right there in their quaint coastal town, officiated by Margaret, the kindly bookstore owner, who had become a surrogate grandmother to Chloe. Chloe, now 6, served as the sole and somewhat chaotic flower girl. She wore a dress made by Audrey and carried the 3-star pendant in a small velvet box. The wedding announcement was a simple photo posted on Dominic's now active, but professionally managed, LinkedIn profile. Dominic Bennett and Audrey Wells announced their marriage. Priorities redefined. The photo was not of a ballroom, but of them smiling on the beach, with Chloe nestled between them. The social media world, which had once devoured their scandal, paused. It was too quiet, too genuine to criticize. It was a checkmate of authenticity, the true victory. Life wasn't suddenly easy. There were late-night arguments about budgeting, forgotten school forms, and the awkward negotiation of co-parenting roles. But through it all, there was communication and commitment. 2 years later, they stood together in their garden, watching Chloe, now 8, confidently explain the life cycle of a butterfly to a very patient Dominic. Audrey realized the magnitude of their victory. Dominic hadn't just returned to her life. He had matured into the man she had always needed him to be. He had traded the cold perfection of his old life for the beautiful, messy reality of being a father and a husband. The greatest triumph wasn't the millions he'd walked away from. It was the quiet, shared life they had built. One honest conversation, and one small act of presence at a time. He learned that control wasn't the secret to happiness. Vulnerability and commitment were. Meaningful ending and call to action. Dominic Bennett's choice to leave the city empire and marry Audrey on the coast was the ultimate act of humility and commitment. He traded the illusion of power for the reality of family. Final question for the audience. Do you think Dominic's father and brother will ever accept this new, quiet life? Or will they continue to try and pull him back to the corporate world? Let me know your theories in the comments below. If you love seeing true redemption, hit like and subscribe for more. Chapter 13. The storm from the city life. In the small coastal town for Audrey and Dominic settled into a comfortable, enduring rhythm. The 3-star silver band became Audrey's favorite piece of jewelry, symbolizing a commitment built on hard-won trust rather than fleeting romance. Chloe, now 8, thrived in the presence of her doting, consistent father, no longer asking why he wasn't there, but simply accepting that he was. Dominic's work evolved further. He rebranded his remaining investment portfolio, focusing entirely on ethical, community-driven startups, a stark contrast to the aggressive takeovers of Bennett and Associates. The price of peace. 2 years after their quiet wedding, the peace was shattered by a direct attack from his old life. Dominic's father and brother, Trevor, saw his commitment to the small town as a weakness and launched a final, aggressive public relations campaign aimed at discrediting Dominic's new ethical ventures. The attack wasn't aimed at his finances, but at his reputation. A series of defamatory articles surfaced in the city's top financial journals, painting Dominic as a failed magnate running a boutique vanity fund, whose recent community investments were merely tax write-offs for a man avoiding true responsibility. The goal was to destroy the credibility of his new ethical funds and disrupt his growing local portfolio. The articles cited an anonymous source, clearly Trevor, claiming Dominic was neglecting a hidden legacy project that was crucial to the family's original vision. The old panic flared in Dominic. He felt the familiar pull of the corporate battlefield, the urge to retaliate with lawsuits and aggressive counter-PR. "They're trying to prove I haven't changed, Audrey." He paced their living room, the coastal serenity feeling fragile. They want me to engage in the old war. Audrey, however, was no longer the jilted bride. She was a woman anchored by resilience. She sat him down, handing him a mug of tea. You don't fight fire with fire, Dom. You fight fire with water. We don't fight their narrative. We build a better one. A true one. Audrey's strategy. The Legacy Project. Dominic looked at her. They're using the term legacy project to imply I'm running away from my roots. The only legacy I care about is Chloe. Then let's claim that word back, Audrey challenged. What if that legacy project wasn't about the old company? What if it was about the future? Your father's attack mentioned that you abandoned a key proposal related to urban revitalization and sustainability. Dominic froze. Years ago, before he left Audrey at the altar, he had indeed toyed with a passion project, a non-profit trust dedicated to turning abandoned inner-city lots into sustainable community hubs. He had shelved it when his father forced the marriage to Serena. The plans are in a forgotten hard drive somewhere, Dominic muttered. I let it go. Find them, Audrey said, her eyes alight with the focus of a true planner. The best way to combat their lie is to unveil a bigger, better truth. Let's launch the Bennett Legacy Trust now. We will use your vanity fund to seed it, and I will be the architect. This was the opportunity for Audrey, the true architect of their life, to step into his professional sphere. Not as a dependent, but as a co-founder of his new identity. The ultimate counter-move, working together, Audrey and Dominic spent the next month quietly resurrecting the trust. Audrey, drawing on her architectural background and her quiet local network, refined the initial plans into a practical, scalable model. The launch was announced not in a glossy financial magazine, but via an exclusive feature in a community news journal and a targeted press release to sustainable infrastructure outlets. The headline was simple and undeniable. Dominic Bennett founds Legacy Trust, dedicating resources to urban community renewal, architected by wife Audrey Bennett. The articles emphasized that the trust was nonprofit, focused entirely on long-term value, and had been conceived years ago, directly refuting the vanity fund claim. The final statement, delivered by Audrey, was the ultimate checkmate. Mr. Bennett's true legacy is not defined by the shares he owns, but by the soil he cultivates. We believe in building communities, not just fortunes. The response from Bennett and Associates was furious, but ineffective. The elegance of the move was that it was unassailable. They couldn't attack a non-profit community trust without looking like soulless villains. Dominic had refused to fight the old war, and instead declared a new one, a moral one, that he had already won. Epilogue. The true measure of success. Years later, the Bennett Legacy Trust became Dominic's main focus, with Audrey serving as the director of design and implementation. They continued to live in their small coastal town, raising Chloe in the quiet world they had fought so hard to protect. Chloe, now a confident teenager, often accompanied her parents to city trust meetings, proud of the sustainable spaces they were creating. She would joke that her dad finally found a job that matched his love for building birdhouses. Dominic had lost the empire he once knew, but in doing so, he had found something far more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect, a genuine purpose, and the unwavering love of his family. He often looked at Audrey, who had healed from betrayal to become his strongest ally, and knew that the greatest fortune was measured not in profit margins, but in the peaceful rhythm of their life together. Final question for the audience. What do you think was the biggest victory for Audrey? The small, quiet wedding on the beach, or the success of the legacy trust that validated her quiet strength? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe.